Without any further ado, I would then like to introduce our first keynote speaker here today, Tomas Akenine-Möller, who has a strong background in computer graphics, one of the pioneers. He has moved across from between academia and into industry, back again, and then back and forth. And he's one of the authorities on current use or development of the GPU and usage thereof. So we're very pleased to have you here, Thomas. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about GPU computing. It's a bit loud, perhaps. Okay, I'll just continue. For graphics and AI. So I'll start with the agenda. First, I'll talk a little bit about Nvidia as a company. That's where I work, and GPU development over the last 20 years or so. Then I'll spend quite a bit of time on GPU architecture, because I think that's interesting for a large portion of the audience here, so that you can tap into the power of the GPU. And I'll also talk about Tensor Course for AI, which are special hardware support for machine learning computations. There's a topic of Raytracing, which is very close to my own research and to my own heart. I've worked on this for 25 years. And then I'll round off with some interesting deep learning applications. So the GPU, that stands for Graphics Processing Unit. And it used to be that you can only use it for rendering graphics, games, architectural visualization, medical visualization, etc. But today it's really a machine that's massively parallel with really huge, computational capabilities and memory access capabilities as well. And if you haven't used them, I think it's time to do so. So our latest GPU looks like this. This is a RTX 2080. It contains the biggest chip ever produced. I'll get back to that with lots of details. So this is a graphic card you put into your desktop computer. But there are GPUs in your mobile phone as well, and in game consoles and whatnot. So very, very briefly about Nvidia as a company. It was founded in 1993 by Jensen Huang, who's still our CEO, and Malachowski and Priem. We have about 13K employees around the world. We have 2 offices in Sweden, one in Lund, where I work, and one in Gothenburg. Now, some really interesting milestones in Nvidia's history. First, in '95, we released our first graphics card. It was built in 500 nanometers technology, so that's a line width of the chip, and it had could deliver 12 million operations per second. Then the next big step was in 2001 when we introduced the first programmable GPU. Much more computational power in that one. Let's see, 800 mega operations per second. And at that point, we also focused only on rendering triangles and lines. The previous architecture could render quadratic surfaces as well. And then, 5 years later, we introduced a GPU called the G80 with CUDA support, and the target there was GPGPU, a term that we don't use any longer, but then it was general purpose computing on a GPU. But now you can compute anything on the GPU, so it's not really used any longer. Then in January this year, I've only worked at Nvidia for 3 years, but this was extremely exciting for me because I've worked on Raytracing for a long time, and so this year we have the first GPU with Raytracing support. I will come back and spend a number of slides on that topic, but it also has support for deep learning, and improved computational capabilities compared to previous architectures as well. And this one is produced in 12 nanometers. It has 9 teraflops in peak compute throughput. So it's a pretty massive machine. And if you look at the GPU evolution, we have some kind of performance on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. You can see that it's been a pretty amazing journey for the GPUs. So before I start with the description of the architecture of the GPU, I just wanted to talk a little bit about rasterization. So the GPU has been engineered over several decades to specialize in drawing triangles. So the triangle is kind of like an atom of geometry. If you make a triangle smaller, it becomes a line, basically. So if you want some kind of surface, triangle is the smallest. So it's been very well optimized for drawing triangles. And so if you look to the right, you can see a scene which could be from some kind of graphics application. And probably a lot of you know this, but the geometry that we use to render that image to the right, that's made of triangles. And I try to visualize the triangles to the left. And so what the rasterization is doing, so it's walking through all the triangles one by one and tries, or it renders them and computes a pixel color for every pixel that's inside the triangle. And then it also resolves visibility. You need to find out which of the triangles are closest to the eye, etc. Okay, so this process of rasterization, okay, it's a little hard to see, but you should be able to see a green triangle there. So this is a 16 by 12 pixel grid, and there's a hierarchy, so there are 4 by 4 pixel tiles as well here, 4 by 3. So to draw that triangle, a GPU usually first decides which bigger regions are inside or potentially overlaps the triangle. So here we avoid processing. We will avoid processing the 2 lower left and the lower right 4 by 4 pixel squares. The next step, you start with each of those 4 by 4 pixel tiles, and you do a parallel test of all those 16 pixels, and you find out exactly which ones are inside. And only then you can go to the next step, where you have a program that's being executed for each pixel. And then you do that for every pixel that's inside the triangle. And then you do that in parallel, and you can then compute images like the ones I showed on the previous slide. All right, so now I'm going to start talking about the GPU architecture. And I will start with a small building block, and then I'll try to build, or I will show how a bigger machine is built by putting these blocks together. Okay, so the smallest interesting block, I just call it a processing block for lack of a better name. It looks like this. There's lots of compute units. There are 16 floating point 32 cores and 16 integer 32-bit cores. And then there are 2 Tensor Cores, and I will talk specifically about those Tensor Cores later on. There's a huge register file compared to a CPU, and the reason for that is to hide latency for memory accesses. We swap in and out warps of compute or of threads, and to be able to hide that latency and maintain a high efficiency, we need to have a really big register file. So 64K register file is pretty big. There are also some special function unit that computes functions such as sine and exponential and square roots, etc. And warp scheduler at the top. So if we just look at peak floating point 32-bit throughput, which is debatable, but it's one number for performance. It's what you can at most get out of the machine. It's probably not what you will get out. But if you look at that, I take 16 because we have 16 floating point cores, and then times the maximum clock frequency, which is 1770 megahertz, and then times 2 because there are instructions called fused, multiply, and add, which can compute both multiplication and addition in a single clock. Then you get 56 gigaflops. So that's, you know, a bit of compute. Now we take 4 of those processing blocks and put into a bigger, you know, processing block, which is called a streaming multiprocessor, or SM for short. It's been a term that Nvidia has used for many years now. Some interesting things in this block, or in the processing block, is that we previously we didn't have concurrent execution of integer data and floating point data, but now we can issue work to both of these and execute at the same time. There's also an enhanced L1 cache. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then if you look at peak floating point 32 throughput, you just multiply by 4 and you get up to 227 gigaflops. All right, so the next step is we take 2 of those SMs, and there's another term for that called a TPC, but it's not very important. But then we take 6 of those. So we have 12 SMs here. And this is called a GPC, which is a graphics processing cluster. And suddenly we have 2.7 teraflops. That's one step. Now we're very close to getting a full GPU. So the Turing architecture, which is our latest architecture, we have named the architectures from famous scientists over the years. So Turing is the current one. Then we have 6 of those GPCs. So now we have quite a lot of compute, and if we do the math, we get up to 16.3 teraflops of compute. Just looking at the number of SMs, we have 72 of those. The number of transistors is amazing, 18.6 billion transistors. I think we had a couple of million in our first chip, so that's quite amazing. So one of my messages here today is that if you're working on deep learning or machine learning AI, and you need a lot of compute, I think you should at least experiment with these kind of architectures and tap into the compute resources here. Somehow you can reach the future faster if you can make your computations faster. Okay, so in this Turing architecture, we made improvements to the streaming multiprocessor, the SM. We added the Raytracing core, the RT core, and that's the first time anyone put Raytracing in hardware. And we also added Tensor Course, specifically for AI. And I'll talk about those later, but as a teaser, there are support for 16-bit floating point, but also integer, 8-bit integers and 4-bit integers. So what we imagine at Nvidia is that the future of real-time graphics will be a combination of rasterization, where we render triangles, as I showed you before, ray tracing, and deep learning. Okay, so let's talk about the SM. I'm just going to see how I'm doing with time. Okay. So let's see. So in the next 3 slides, this one included, I will gloss over some of the details because for 2 reasons, really. There are comparisons to our previous architectures, which is hard to make sense of if you don't know the previous architecture much. And also, I know too little about these topics. But there are some interesting bits here. So the Turing microarchitecture, as you remember, the SM contained 4 of those processing blocks, and those are called subcores here. Each of these subcores can issue one warp, where one warp is 32 threads, and threads is not in the CPU language. Thread is just one unit of computation, a floating point computation for a program. And there are some improvements to the schedulers and to the cache, which is unified. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So for the audience here, I think the really interesting thing is that we've added those Tensor Course. And if you, for example, look at what you can get with 8-bit integer computations, you see that we can get 8 by 8 by 16 computations per 4 clock. And those can be used for matrix multiplications, which is a key type of computations in DL. Okay, so in terms of cache and shared memory, this is a comparison to Pascal, which is our previous architecture. But basically, we've made the SM smaller. We've made them share L2 cache, and there's also nowadays we have a unified L1 cache. Previously, those were kind of separate, but now we divide or we share cache for L1 texture caching and shared memories or shared memory computations inside the SM, and those were not unified previously. And that has given us a number of benefits. In addition, the L1 cache can be split into 2 parts, where one is dedicated to one type of computations and the other part is dedicated to another type of computations. So for example, you can divide the 96K shared or the L1 cache so that you have 64K dedicated to shader computations and 32K for texture cache and register spill. But if you do general purpose computations, you can share, or you can split it so that you have 32K for shared memory and then 64K, common L1 cache, or the other way around. And that could be pretty useful. So I talked a little bit about, that we had both, that we have concurrent integer and floating point 32-bit execution. And what we saw in, this is something that's been done in CPUs for a while, I'm sure, but we saw in our typical gaming applications, we saw that for every 100 FP instructions, there would also be about 30 or 36 integer instructions. So we realized that there was a lot to be gained to make them, to make these parallel. And in total, with all the improvements that we made in Turing, and compared to our previous architecture called Pascal, we have about 50 or more than 50% improvement in pure performance. And those bars here are different 3D games and 3D benchmarks. Okay. Let's see. So next I'll talk about Tensor Course for AI. And let's see. So I think this is what many of you in the audience will be interested to hear about. So I'll present what kind of information I have found and that I also can share. But I know that reducing the precision in AI computations can often be done with retained results. So instead of doing all the computations in doubles or floating point 32-bit, you can go down to 16-bit floating point, or sometimes even 8-bit integers or 4-bit integers. And so we've added that to those Tensor Cores, and previously we could compute, when you have a matrix multiply plus another matrix, we could compute one row times a column and then add one value. But now it's much more parallel, and so we do huge parts of this matrix multiply completely in parallel. And that gives us, 114 teraflops of floating point 16 in throughput. And then you double that when you go up to integer 8-bit, and double again when you go to 4-bit integer. And it's also good to know that we don't overflow the 4-bit values. We do all the accumulation in 32-bit registers. So otherwise it wouldn't be very useful. Okay. So in terms of deep learning performance compared to our previous architecture and also compared to a CPU, you can see that for speech inference, we get about a 5 times improvement compared to our previous P4 architecture. P is for Pascal and T for, the T is for Turing. 5 times speed up with RT cores, and then we have 3 or 2.7 and 3.6 times speed ups for those other video inference and language inference. So it's pretty big leap in terms of performance for these applications. Also, we kind of expect deep learning to be a disruption to gaming and professional graphics, similarly to how it has disrupted other areas of research and application spaces. And it's really exciting, and we're kind of at the beginning of this, and it'll be really interesting to see what's possible and what people can do with this kind of hardware. So these are a couple of applications that colleagues of mine have done research on in relation to computer graphics. So DLSS up to the top left is a technique for removing aliasing or the jaggies in the rendered images. We have our Finnish colleagues have worked a lot on facial and character animation, and it's really important in graphics to have accurate descriptions of material properties. So, for example, if a photon comes into a surface, you need to be able to very accurately and precisely describe how it interacts with that surface, because if it hits my hand, it really should look like a hand, and that could be, depending on the type of surface, you need to be careful what you do. So there's been some advancement there as well. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about ray tracing for a while, and this is something I do research on myself. I've done that for, I think, 25 years or so, and it's really exciting because it can make the images look much more realistic. So in computer graphics, we have this goal of reaching photorealism, and it's a term we use to say that we want the images to be so real that we can't see the difference between a photograph and a rendered image. And the reason why ray tracing is better than rasterization is that it's based on the physics of light. So here's an image that's been rendered at 30 frames per second. So that's 33 milliseconds to compute this image. And it's done with ray tracing. You can see there's a depth of field effect, which is simple to do with ray tracing. And I'll explain why in a bit. So depth of field is where you have the person here in the middle is in focus, and then the foreground and background are blurred out a bit, so you get this sense of depth. There are also very accurate reflections and shadows in this image, and doing accurate reflections with rasterization is extremely hard, if not impossible, to do that fast. Okay, so I'm going to talk about ray tracing for a little bit. So the difference between rasterization and ray tracing is that with rasterization, you need to have a shared origin of your rays, of where you compute visibility in. So for example, if you have a camera that originates from a single point, you can send out rays from that point. But with ray tracing, you can shoot your rays in any direction, anytime. And that gives you a lot of flexibility, and that is what makes it possible to simulate the physics of light. And so with that, you suddenly, it's possible to have global effects, such as reflections and indirect lighting, etc. And that increases the level of realism in your images. So really, what we want to do is to follow photons from a light source. There's a light source to the right at the top. And then in ray tracing, you usually start from the eye and follow the photons kind of backwards, because otherwise it'll take too long for the image to converge. But there are some, ray tracing is used very extensively nowadays in feature films, where they need to use computer graphics to make special effects, for example. That switched maybe 5-10 years ago. That industry switched completely to using ray tracing. And before that, it was actually rasterization based as well. And now graphics hardware is coming after the same type of effects. But there are some fundamental building blocks in ray tracing, and those are sampling, traversal and intersection, and material evaluation. So on our previous architecture, so to render an image of that rabbit, you have some kind of hierarchical data structure, because you cannot search, for each ray, you cannot search all the triangles in your model to find which one the ray hits. You need to have some hierarchical data structure, and that's usually some kind of tree with boxes in each inner node and triangles in at the leaves. And previously that was done on the SMs in pure computations with no hardware support, and that could take quite a long time to do compared to what we're doing now in Turing, where we've put big portions of this into hardware instead. So the amount of improvements in performance is really interesting to see. So one researcher at Nvidia took a frame from Quake 2 and added ray tracing to that, and that's the image you see to the lower right. And if we use our previous architecture, Pascal, we see that at the top, those gray, this gray little curve, and the width of the x-axis is basically how long it took to render that image, and we get that image takes 200 milliseconds to render. Now, if we use Turing, which is a middle diagram, and don't use the RT course, we just use the improved SMs and the improved architecture in general, we kind of cut that into half, so that takes 97 milliseconds. And then if we turn on the RT course as well, we get about 34 frames per second for this kind of scene. So it's a pretty huge leap in terms of performance. All right, so I've talked about the Turing GPU, both SM cores, Tensor Course, and the RT cores. And there are many more features of that chip, which you can look up into. If you want to, there's a Turing white paper from Nvidia with lots of detail on those topics. Okay, so I'll try to round off with some deep learning applications that we have looked into at Nvidia. This is just a small sampling from areas where, which I'm interested in, more or less. So the first one is something we called denoising. So I hope you can see that the left part of this image is really noisy or grainy, and the right one is much smoother, clearer image. And the reason why the left part is noisy is that we use, to get to these kind of global illumination effects with ray tracing, we use Monte Carlo sampling techniques. And when you do, so it's a kind of a random sampling technique, more or less random. And that gives you noise in your images, but it also gives you realism. And computing this image in with really, really good quality could take minutes or hours. So with deep learning and also with in the computer graphics community in general, we've looked into filters on how to try to remove that type of noise quickly without destroying the image. And with deep learning, several of my colleagues have worked on this and are still working on it. It's still not a completely solved problem. And the trick is that you need a lot of time. So let's say you want to render at 60 frames per second. Then you have 16 milliseconds to complete the frame in total. And then that means that the denoising, you have to finish that part in 1 millisecond or maybe 2. So you need to have really quick algorithms and fast hardware to be able to do this. But so the right part of this image is rendered with the same quality as shown to the left, but then we've run a deep learning denoising filter on top of that, and you can see a lot of the noise has disappeared. So that means that we can get close to real-time performance or get to real-time performance. So another example is AI image generation. So at the top here, some people have drawn some crude images, and each color means a different type of background or image content. So blue is sky, dark blue is sea, green is grass, etc. So the people have drawn the images at the top, and then we have kind of style images to the left. So if you take the one image at the top and you combine it with the left image, you get the image in the middle. And that's just been computed using a system called Gauguin, after a post-impressionist painter. And it looks pretty convincing most of the time. I tried to do it myself, and I failed a few times, and I succeeded a few times. Another thing that people have worked on is in painting. So here I've violated Einstein a little bit. In painting is a process where you want to remove some part of your image, for example, red eyes in photographs. But now, with November and everything, I've tried to remove his mustache. And so this is what Einstein could look like. It looks, yeah, I don't know. All right. Next thing is also by our Finnish colleagues in Helsinki. Here we have a similar thing. We have kind of styles from the left column, and then we have inputs at the top. So for example, if you take the little boy and you want to see that boy in the style of the woman at the bottom left, you get the little boy in the middle at the bottom. It's there are lots of more research from that team. They've, for example, taken a database of celebrities and then tried to generate new celebrities that look good. And it works convincingly, or sometimes scarily good. Sometimes it does not, but yeah. Let's see. So I would like to show a video of real-time Raytracing, and I think I can take questions during this video, or if you want to remain silent and look at the video, we can do that as well. But that's pretty much, so now we should have sound as well. So this is rendered in real time on an RTX 280. This was a huge effort for the launch of the Turing architecture. That's bad. Okay. You should have told me earlier. I see it. We only tested the sound before. Let's see. Classic. Okay. Det verkar inte som videon vill riktigt visa sig. Ja, det tyckte jag gjorde det. Ja. 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 Thank you very much. Okay, so here we are. So these images were rendered in real time, 30 images per second, with ray tracing combined with rasterization and a filter for removing noise. You can see there are effects such as reflections, shadows, pretty nice materials. There's a strong depth of field focus effect. And if there are questions, I can take them, or we can look at the images in silence. It's a 2-minute video or so. And that concludes my talk, I think.
Okay, so thank you very much, Thomas. I'm sure we have, while you're watching the wonderful video, I'm sure we have time for a few questions here for Thomas. Anyone who wants to start? Okay, okay, go ahead.
So power dissipation is an important topic for systems like this. Do you want to comment on that a little bit?
That's a difficult topic for me. But I know there have been a lot of work done at Nvidia to reduce power usage for our chips. And it became a huge problem a couple of architectures ago. So I think one of the architectures that was developed, I think it was Fermi. I'm not 100% sure about this. It was redesigned from, bottom up to be a much more power efficient architecture. And of course we need to be able to push down power as well, because sometimes we're interested in how much energy per compute you're using. So it's a good question, but I'm not sure exactly how much is done. But if you improve memory systems, you usually improve energy efficiency as well. But yeah, I can't say too much about it. I can try to find out if you want to. But yeah, it's a good question. Var den slut?
That's a question over there from Patrick, a person I know.
Patrick Young from Linköping University. So this is a ray tracing question, actually.
Okay.
There's not much talk about how you construct the BVH for dynamic scenes like this. So is that hardware accelerated and supported as well, or pure software on the driver, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's two answers. Either I don't know or I can't tell you, but I'm going to leave it at that. But yeah, there's a lot of effort going into how the data structure is being built, because it dictates performance. So you need to be really careful when you build the BVH data structure. And that's part of my research. I'm doing a little bit of research on that right now to improve how the BVHs are being built. But yeah, it's a good question, but I can't give you much more than that, unfortunately.
So here's a high-level question from my side. You're running with the microphone. I'll just ask a quick question.
Oh, okay.
It seems to me very serendipitous that GPUs turned out to be the computing elements also for other aspects, like particularly now in machine learning. But that progress already started with the GPU and CUDA and all of those developments. But there's now an overlap in time. Do you see that overlap between the applications in graphics and in machine learning? Is the architecture, is that going to continue developing the same line, or is one going to take over the other? Or is machine learning going to dictate the graphics processing in the future?
could be, but I think it's hard to say. But there are definitely units in the GPU that are so specialized and so extremely well engineered, and the evolution has gone on for a few decades, and I don't think we can just cut them out of the GPU. For example, texture processing and rasterization, but also ray tracing. No, I don't think there's too much to gain from having specialized hardware. But the rest of the machine, which is the majority, can be used for machine learning.
Right.
So I think they will coexist, but that's my own opinion. I'm not sure.
Biased. Yes, we have one more question, and then we have to wrap up. Yes, go ahead.
A question on programmability. If we would take these new GPUs and give them to a bunch of well-supervised PhD students that do not have access to your secret information, could they utilize this both for machine learning and for ray tracing?
Yeah, so I'm not a machine learning researcher myself, but I mean, you can use PyTorch, for example, and just if you configure it correctly, and there's no hidden magic or no secrets in that, then you can run your experiments on a GPU. And there are lots of other TensorFlow, for example, and I think MATLAB even, if you want to do that. So it's definitely not some hidden secret sauce that we have. It's exposed to everyone. But we can talk more if you want.
Right, and Thomas is going to be around during the rest of the day, so if you have any detailed questions about his work or Nvidia, you can ask him, and his answer is going to be, I can't tell you. But you can always ask him. But thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us, Thomas. Thanks,
thank you
very
very
much.